Multilateralism is once again under pressure following former U.S. President Donald Trump's renewed call for the United States. This is to withdraw from key international institutions. Critics warn that such moves could weaken global cooperation at a time of rising geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainty. To unpack what this means for global governance, the global south, and the future of multilateral institutions, we're now joined by Lebogang Pheko, who's the Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective. Thank you so much for your time on the program this hour. Perhaps let's start by unpacking what does a U.S. withdrawal from key international institutions signal about the future of multilateralism?
Thanks so much. There are a few things. The one, it illustrates that there's a jurisdiction that's narrowing in the way that we're going to be able to see global governance unfolding. It also means that we're going to see an increase in politicized compliance. And it also means that we're going to see enforcement dependent on power backing. So at the moment, what we've seen is that we've had predictability, we've had universality, we've also had institutions that enforce norms and rules, and hence we talk about rules-based governance. But what we're seeing now is that even though the rules exist, they can be applied arbitrarily or at discretion differently. It also means that they can be enforced selectively. And in this kind of environment, we'll see a few things. Firstly, there'll be a shift in power alignments, potentially. We'll also see that the laws which are in existence right now will then be used as toolkits rather than as menus, as prescripts. And lastly, we're going to see, of course, that these harder edges and thinner norms that are going to subsist over the next few years, potentially, meaning that there's less stability, less certainty, and a much greater move towards governance and institutional norms building by coercion or by incentive rather than by morality and ethics.
And so many chats have also been had around this and its potential to shift or affect global stability. Can you perhaps maybe expand on that for us?
So there are a few areas. Trade and investment is one of them. Climate is another, human rights, international justice, and we've seen that in the case of South Africa taking Israel to the international courts, in the context, of course, as well as of use of force and accountabilities. Where are these power shifts going to begin to reconfigure, and what can we draw from previous case studies? So I think that, for example, I'd like us to point to the Brexit, the United Kingdom, which also tried in the last few years, to remove itself from a regional governance institution. And although the two are not identical, but it does give us a few indicators. What it has done there is it has increased the sense of instability for the UK. It has, in fact, caused an increase in trades and tariffs, the cost of living, the cost of food has increased, or the ways in which people are feeling general uncertainty. It has also meant that rather than being an inevitable part of of that particular governance structure, and being able to take decisions as part of that governance structure, they're just one of many other states. And what we're probably going to see in this context is that countries that are the most vulnerabilized, either financially, economically, racially, it has to be said, might be the ones that should bear the most brunt of this. We're also going to potentially see shifting opportunistic alliances. And we've seen a few countries on this continent which have said and made pronouncements around, for example, Israel, and so on, which seem entirely to be parroting that of the United States. And then the other thing that we might potentially see, though, is that different actors emerging. So we're already, inevitably, it looks as though China might be one of the biggest gainers, might gain the most, power dividends from this shift. The European Union might be able to reassert themselves. The NATO might be able to reassert themselves. But in all of this, our question always has to be, where does this leave the majority world, the global south, particularly African countries? And I think this is also an opportunity for the African Union, such as it is, to reassert itself, and for our regional economic communities to become much more robust and much more rigorous in naming what is our own positionality, our own international relations footprint, what are our own regional and national priorities, and to perhaps take the vacuum as an opportunity to reimagine what a world looks like without a particular hegemonic center at the head of it.
And I'm glad that you made that point, because it leads me straight to my next question, because I'd like to know, does the US somewhat, gain leverage by walking away, or does it somehow forfeit that leverage by surrendering seats at the table? I guess the question would be, can the US realistically shape global rules from the outside?
Yeah. So, I mean, this whole notion, policy, it has been influenced by the notion of taking back control, make America great again, America first. What they also imagine is that they're going to be reducing external constraints and reassert national decision making. But what happens is that even though when multilateral rules are portrayed as national constraints rather than assets, and we should really view multilateralism as a global asset where we are all in some respect at the same table, such as it is, and trying to at least think around governance in ways that are consistent and that are democratized. And also in the context of the US, where financial contributions are framed as losses rather than some kind of a global insurance, what has happened instead is that there's trade friction that has emerged. And what would happen potentially in the US is that even if they try to come back to these institutions, they will have to go back to the back of the queue. It also means, by the way, that just because they have given notice to withdraw, a lot of these notices are not instantaneous. It's not like, you give notice today on a Friday, and then on Monday, your obligations have suddenly evaporated. There are financial obligations, there are governance obligations, there are regulatory obligations, there are some treaties that are only going to phase out over months, sometimes even years. So in as much as it's a very dramatic announcement, the modalities of coming out of it, of removing oneself from multilateralism, are actually quite difficult. If I can again point to the Brexit, where it took years for the UK to put in notice, notice of their exit, and a very tightly negotiated arrangement for their exit, which even despite all of the relative civility that took place in the precursor to their exit, has not played out very well. It also shows when see that, of course, there can be a lot of friction that might replace this cooperation. And lastly, to state that even if the US wants to come back later, their power, their influence, the world is moving forward. Any single country needs to appreciate that the world moves forward with or without them, and that there is no way of retrograding and retroactively reinstating voice, power, and influence. The other thing, of course, is that some of their financial obligations, despite what Mr. Trump would like to believe, they are still subject to several of their financial institutions as part of these various institutions, and that some of those obligations may, as I say, not be able to may not phase out immediately. Some of them might still phase out over the next year or two.
But also, how does this land with the US allies who rely heavily on multilateralism frameworks for security and trade? Does this reinforce somewhat of a perception that US commitments are conditional and somewhat reversible?
So it certainly shows that in terms of the strategic bottom line for US and the African countries, US and Asian countries, US and US and any number of their bilateral partners, such as it is, and although they haven't been very nice partners to many of us over the last year or two, it declines from kind of being their position from being an agenda setter to being an optional partner. It also means that it changes their position from a very narrow, security-centric, very less trusted partner and less trusted player. And one of the great dividends and currencies of multilateralism, policy, is trust. and mutual respect, which have been sadly lacking, completely lacking over the last few months or the last 12 months or so. It also, I think in this, the US needs to appreciate that they might be replaced, and that influence is hardly ever paused. Nobody sits and waits for things to happen. The G20 was an excellent precursor of the room continues even though the seat is empty. Conversations will continue, and the empty seat has no voice. And again, they need to rethink the idea that somehow they are indispensable. Important, yes. Influential, yes. Indispensable remains to be seen. What we do need to be careful, though, is this reimagining of this America First, which is actually going to a very bullish position. And this is not the first time, by the way, that the US has opted out of multilateral institutions. The role of the US, for example, in the Regional League of Nations, a problematic institution in and of itself of colonial powers, but that's a story for another day. They refused to participate. They only came into multilateralism as we understand it today in the late 1960s and 70s, when then their role in the United Nations became much more preeminent, mainly because of a debt that they had managed to pay. The United Nations was actually floundering financially, and the US essentially under Reagan bought their way in by redeeming a lot of that debt and, of course, buying a large shareholding into the UN. Hence, we see the prominence of the last few decades. But prior to that, the US had been a marginal player in global politics, and their interest was much more in the bilateral rivalry between themselves and the Soviet Union. Now, this is not 1958. This is not Cold War. This is a multipolar world. And so the imprint of their absence is very different, right. But there are also different players. There are also different poles of power in 2026, including many from the global south. BRICS being an influential pole of power, if the BRICS nations are able to leverage that power much more effectively than they have so far.
All right, I must say, always great chatting. That's Lebogang Pheko, who's the Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective. Thank you so much for your time and insights on the program.